Today, we're connecting with Dee Lanier, the co-author of The Promises and Perils of AI in Education. We're going to dive into really important topics like accessibility, bias, and co-design, key considerations to unlock the true power of artificial intelligence in education. This is EdHeads. So, Dee, it's such a pleasure to have you on EdHeads. I've been so excited to chat with you ever since I read your book with Ken, The Promise and Perils of AI in Education. Ethics and equity have entered the chat.
Yes.
Boom.
Yep.
And what I really appreciate about this book is that you are really authentic and genuine in your voice. You talk about key considerations for education leaders and why they're important. And along the way, you have so many incredible mic drop moments that really push us to think critically. And I really appreciate that. And you do it right out of the gate. I mean, on the second page of this book, you write, "We have no intention of shrouding our message in palatable platitudes to appease those who prioritize comfort over justice." So why was it important to you to start the book that way?
I would say that the reason why I wanted to start off my own narrative in that was because in many ways writing this book was in response to many things that we had been observing over the past year or so as it relates to the conversations about AI and education. And the two things that I hear regularly is about using AI effectively, right? And using it for the sake of efficiency. And both of those things are fine in and of themselves, but we're like, wait, there's a much larger conversation to be had, much more impactful in terms of what the consequences could be, in particular for students of color. And so what we're going to do is say, if what you want or need is a self-help guide into understanding AI and a recipe booklet for utilizing AI, there are plenty of other resources for that, and you can find them. This book is going to speak very openly, directly, unapologetically about ethics and equity, which seem to be missing from the conversation.
To summarize some of the key themes here, to you and Ken, unlocking AI's remarkable potential requires three key principles: intentional development, ethical regulation, and inclusive design literacy. So why are these important considerations that you feature in this book?
Sure. Again, they are sort of missing pieces in the conversation. When you look at AI only or solely from the perspective of this is how a teacher can utilize it for grading papers or creating lesson plans, or, you know, the various ways in which a teacher can utilize AI. Or if you're looking at it from here are ways in which you want to ensure that students aren't cheating using AI, if that's where the conversation ends, then what you're having is a conversation that is not really considering not only all of the factors that are involved, but all the institutions that are involved, right? And so there's more than just thinking from a business perspective. I used to be a high school business teacher. You're more than just the consumer of the product, but who are the developers of the product and who are the regulators of the product, and how do those different parties interact, right? And there's consumer power for sure, but consumer power in terms of empowerment doesn't come out of nowhere. It has to come from some sense of knowledge of how things are being formulated for them, and then how are things regulated. And when a consumer recognizes those things, and I'm thinking about students and teachers and administrators and schools in general, and they consider, wait a minute, there are bad faith actors involved in this, and there are bad practices that are involved in this. And it's actually part of what we do in education is help equip students and teachers to learn about these different systems and how to impact them. And so we actually have an opportunity to go at these right now, because it's emergent. It's right. It's current. Also, it's relevant. It's right in front of us. And so therefore, let's look at it. Let's explore it. Let's investigate it. Let's potentially, if necessary, oppose certain aspects of it.
All right. There's so much to unpack there. And we'll be able to unpack some of it.
Yep.
You mentioned cheating, which there's a substantial section in your book about cheating. I mean, you do walk people through like what is AI, any considerations, but you talk about cheating a lot because many educators are concerned about plagiarism. But you and Ken points out that this isn't actually the most essential matter for leaders to think about. So is the concern about cheating a mistake? Like, how should education leaders think about it?
Yeah. I would say it's still just an incomplete thought. It's not that it is a wrong thought. It is just simply not the whole picture. But what we recognize, Ken and I both recognized early on, that it was the primary consideration. When ChatGPT came on the scene, November 2022, almost immediately the first thing we started hearing was, oh no. And the oh no flags were students are going to use this to cheat, in particular in writing papers. And we're like, wait a minute. He and I, from a personal standpoint, were having conversations about, oh, we have bigger oh no's that we're concerned with personally. I'm concerned more about potential criminalization. I'm concerned more about ways in which these tools can be used to further, right, criminalize students that look like me. And so why is that not a healthy part of this conversation? And then finding it intriguing that, oh, writing is the number one concern and cheating in writing, instead of asking the question, why would a student be tempted to quote unquote cheat? What are some of the problems that are inherent in an education system that make, if something can make this easier or simpler to get away with, then why is there such a strong temptation, right, that exists? I know it's that's sort of philosophical, right, but it still just exists. And then Ken, he got really perturbed because he and I are both definitions guys, but we have our quirks, right? And he's like, and the definition of plagiarism does not apply to AI. And I'm like, tell me more. And so he was the first to point out to me Black's Law Dictionary has a definition, and subsequently I've looked at other law books, a Cornell Law School, defining what plagiarism is and saying, wait, if you're just going to put a label or a tag on something and this is an improper tag, then that's not even correct. And all it takes is for someone to challenge this notion of cheating because it's plagiarism with the true definition of what plagiarism is. And again, all we're doing is skirting around the primary issue, which is lack of relevance and responsiveness in our education as a whole, and a primary mode in which we evaluate students, which is, if it's not in a multiple choice test, it's in writing exclusively. Mm-hmm. And so it's this exclusive ways in which that we've done things and we continue to do things that then AI becomes a part of the conversation and then says, oh, what? We don't want AI to disrupt the system and how we have it in current play. And we say, wait, there's actually bigger questions that should be asking, and if this is disturbing things, we don't have a problem with that aspect of it.
Oh, wow. And so, in other words, the possibility of cheating really is a symptom of a bigger challenge. And you're saying, hey, ask ourselves, should we radically rethink how we're testing, pedagogy, all these other things before we immediately start focusing on how we're using AI in the context of these current institutions that we've designed that have already been inequitable and create conditions where students want to do these types of things.
Exactly.
There's a piece in this book that really shook me to my core in many ways because I've experienced it firsthand. And in the book, Ken talks about an example of when he is in China in the airport, and the airport has artificial intelligence for facial recognition, and he was stopped and he was pulled aside and questioned. I've experienced that firsthand. And when I was in Dublin, artificial intelligence, I felt I was like, I know exactly what Ken is talking about. And the co-founder Saga, he was there when that happened. He was watching this happen. I was pulled over, set aside, and there was nothing in my backpack. They were kind of going through my stuff, stalling. And I remember Alan like, pulling me aside, checking in on me, the co-founder of Saga, saying, "Are you right?" And he recognized that something not right's happening. You also talk about a person named Robert Williams who was falsely arrested in 2020 because of failed, facial recognition system. And so tell me a little bit more why you both decided to share this example, and what are the parallels between this and what you see in education?
Well, why we shared it is because one of our immediate fears and worries that was different than what we recognize many of our other colleagues, those of us who are in the work of professional development, and then hearing from teachers primarily, again, bringing back, I think, to one of your first questions, their biggest concern was around plagiarizing and cheating written work. And my primary concern, and Ken's primary concern, was around potential exacerbating what we have as already an over criminalization problem in our society and at large, and the prison pipeline connection to preschool, right? You always call it the school to prison pipeline, and it's the preschool to prison pipeline. If you consider what is an artificial intelligent tool being aimed for, right, identifying criminal behavior or, quote, suspicious behavior. Well, who is labeling these things as suspicious? Why is this suspicious? Well, in many ways, it's because it is different than what is standard or norm. And so if you consider so many different things, whether it be from surveillance and monitoring software that's being literally pitched and sold to schools, to even things that have good intention, like SEL bots, right? Social emotional learning bots that are recognizing if you seem to be disinterested, bored, or not paying attention, right? Every single one of those we look at as what can be looked at as this is to protect the community, can also be used to target and to criminalize people who are not guilty in something, and also something that is looked at as this is to support and help a student, can also be utilized to identify deviant behavior. Again, we already see these things in society done by human eyes and human opinion, from teachers to administrators. Now, the same people who are involved in bringing about justice in some way, shape, or form in our society are also helping influence the development of these tools. And now, so we're identifying what we look at as suspicious behavior or just a suspicious looking person.
What's really important for people watching this and listening to this is that this causes real harm. When you're talking about Robert Williams, his life was turned completely upside down. He lost his job. He was in prison for a week. All these other implications because the flaws in AI. And maybe this AI, this facial recognition, had good intent. Maybe to be more efficient. Maybe to help reduce. But it, because of how it was trained, it manifested itself in a very unproductive and harmful way. And it's not just him. I mean, it happened to me. And what's amazing is that when Ken called you to tell you about this, what did you say?
I said, well, he set it up and he said, it started as a text, right? And he said, remind me to tell you about what happened to me at the Hong Kong airport. Let's just say it started with the facial recognition software. And I responded with, I already know. Again, anything that's predictable is preventable. But then to hear the pain from my brother, what he experienced in that scenario, which was very frustrating. And then it was also automatically relatable, similar to the story that you just shared about Dublin, similar to what's happened to me on a couple of different occasions now of me wearing, so when I travel, I typically am wearing jogger sweatpants, right? So I'm wearing, because I am also very actively attempting to do everything in my power to not set off any kind of alarm, right? But for an alarm to go off and for then to be asked or be told I need to be frisked, and then to be asked would I like to do this behind closed doors or right here, and I always say right here. And notice I always say, because it's happened to me multiple times, and it's a humiliating affair, but I've done that in witness of others to see this is the humiliation that I'm experiencing because of something that a monitor set off that said that I may have something in this area of my body, and look what is happening to me. And I remember seeing a colleague recently when that was happening, looking and the shock and horror her face, and she started mouthing to me, "I'm so sorry." And for people to know, or to at least hear and understand, for people of color, when things like that happen, because of the catalog of examples that have happened to us regularly in the past, then of course it's a suspicious question in our minds. Is this because of my ethnicity? Is this because of my skin color? Is this because I look suspicious? Matter of fact, talking about bias, I have confirmation bias based on this experience being so prevalent in my personal life that makes me say, I think that's what this is. And for people to at least have an empathetic heart to hear that, and to hear the reason why this is so concerning, the reason why synthetic media is so concerning to people of color, to students of color, is because of ways in which it has been, example after example, used and has criminalized people, then you would maybe get a little bit of understanding.
Let's think about the scenario in education context. That where we potentially can be relying on these AI tools to improve efficiencies. And if these AI tools are now determining where students go for classes, how they're assigned things, even affective computation when you're looking at emotional states and determining whether a student is being disruptive or not, we're creating we have to be very thoughtful about it, because now we have platforms can create widespread, you were talking about dramatically accelerating potential inequities and harm, right? And so this is why this matters.
Absolutely.
And in this book, you talk about not only what leaders should think about, but why it's important.
If I may add, how they can at least use some foundational skills in mitigating some of the potential harms. So for instance, right in the very beginning, as you pointed out, say, not interested in giving you mindless platitudes. For example, those who are, I think, good faith actors communicating about all the positive ways in which you can utilize AI in the classroom for your lesson planning or what have you, may mention, and I give them credit for mentioning, the warnings of bias, both in the input and the output, right? Both in data sets as well as what is reflected in the results from AI. I'm like, great, excellent, seriously. In addition to that, define what bias is, and then help the teachers, if it's a professional development setting, and administrators to even understand what bias is and how they can recognize it. So one of the things I do is say, bias is oftentimes just confirming of what you already believe, right? Am I right? And so giving a framework of understanding that bias looks like avoiding objective facts. It looks like saying, I am going to ignore what I understand currently, avoiding things that is objectively true, right? Misinterpreting facts. So even when facts are placed in front of you, misinterpreting them, right? Ignoring additional information even when it's given to you, or remembering only the things that confirmed what you already believe, right? So if you have at least an understanding of bias looks like this, and this is also how, when you read an article, when you watch television, when you interact with others, This is how bias is at play personally. Now that you can sniff what bias is, and you can start to check yourself if you recognize I am doing those things. Now when we talk about there's bias in the data sets, you at least know what we're talking about.
I'm a radical optimist in many ways.
Sure.
I think we've talked about the challenges.
Yep.
But there are many beautiful things on the horizon if we can properly combine the power of humans and technology.
Yep.
Let's talk a little bit more about that and how you approach the book and this cover itself, because there's so much meaning in this. So let's start off with the book. And how you approach using best of human capital and technology to bring this to life.
Sure. Well, it started as a conversation, literally recorded conversations between Ken and I. We first brainstormed over some of the categories of things that we wanted to talk about. We then leveraged AI, ironically enough, to then summarize what some of those talking points are, categorize them to say, okay, well, if it's going to go in this order, then now we know what our talking points are. So then we revolve from personal human to technology integrated to now back to the human. We then were responsive to those talking points, and we had regular conversation based on our own knowledge, experience, education, and we recorded those, and then we transcribed those conversations, and then we utilized AI again for itemizing certain summary points. We reformulated certain things, and then we had a working transcript. And then we said, now the writing begins. Right? So after we had this huge transcript, we said, now the writing begins. And we began writing and editing. And then we also brought in a human editor who then would say, work on this part, work on that part. And then the biggest contribution I think that she made to us was to say, when we got to the point where we thought we were ready and we were done, we're ready to publish, she said, it's missing the personal element. I think it has fantastic information, but when I hear some of your conversations, I hear the personal side. What I don't see in your writing is the personal side. So that's when the suggestion came in for us adding more of the portions that are in italics, was just Ken's voice directly just sharing his experience, my voice just directly sharing our experience. Sometimes us being responsive to one another. Sometimes us reading through what we had now co-written and then saying, you know what, that reminds me of something else, and then writing those elements in. So that's where that interchange between each other and then using AI as a help also came into play. And then the cover art was a part of that as well. We were committed to certain things, and we thought it would be important to utilize AI for the cover art because it is an example of us using AI for creativity, but then also being very transparent in the thought process in that development. And so we put in the very beginning of the book, and we disclose what's the prompt that eventually came to this, right, artwork, and that was a process. And it was a lot of conversation over what we wanted the art to represent, and then evaluation of what the different outputs were, to then us coming to a conclusion and saying, that's it. When we finally looked at it after multiple hours, that's it. That's the artwork. And then we took it to a human designer to then work with that as the base frame and then say, help develop all these other elements around it. And so it was very much a conversation all the time. It was a conversation between me and my best friend, and us then reviewing and evaluating something that then became objective between us, and then us having an outside view that then was informing us of ways in which we can continue to modify to then produce what you now see.
Well, Dee, and also Ken,
my brother,
I really appreciate you taking the time to share these important insights in such an authentic and meaningful way. Right. The promises and perils of AI in education. Please take a look at it if you're listening in or you're watching. It's definitely going to push your thinking. Again, both you and Ken emphasize what we should be thinking about as education leaders and why it's important. And the next guest, we're going to have Tema, who's done a lot of randomized trials on bias in education. share some harrowing data of like what's at stake when we don't do it. And so if you're listening in, definitely keep out for the next episode. But I appreciate you. I appreciate your leadership. And thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, AJ.